December 1942. When the first American Sherman tanks rolled off production lines, even America's closest allies couldn't hide their laughter. The thin armor, modest gun, and simple design seemed like a joke compared to the fearsome German Tigers and Panthers that were dominating European battlefields. But by June 1944, over 80,000 of these inferior tanks were steamrolling across Europe, and suddenly no one was laughing anymore. What did the Americans understand about winning wars that every other nation had completely missed? Snow fell on the factories of Detroit as the first Sherman tanks rolled off the assembly lines. Inside the hot, loud buildings, workers welded steel plates that seemed too thin. The tanks looked simple, almost plain. Their 75mm guns seemed small compared to the massive cannons everyone had heard about on German tanks. The armor was only 2 inches thick in most places. A grown man could easily climb onto the low, boxy hull. Across the ocean, Allied commanders gathered in smoky rooms to look at pictures and reports of America's new tank. British generals who had been fighting German panzers for 3 years shook their heads. They had seen what German 80mm guns could do to thick British armor. These American tanks looked like death traps. Soviet officers, fresh from battles where German Tigers had smashed through their best tanks, wondered if the Americans understood war at all. The Sherman weighed only 30 tons. German Tigers weighed 60 tons. The math seemed simple and terrifying. In the factories, American engineers worked day and night. They chose simple designs over complex ones. They picked reliable parts over fancy ones. While German factories struggled to build a few dozen advanced tanks each month, American plants churned out hundreds of Shermans. The workers could build a Sherman in just a few hours using parts that any mechanic could fix. German tanks needed special tools and rare metals. Sherman tanks needed basic steel and simple engines that any garage could repair. Allied tank crews who trained on early Shermans felt the thin armor under their hands. They sat in the cramped turrets and wondered how they would survive against the giant German guns they had heard so much about. The Sherman's armor could stop rifle bullets and small shells, but everyone whispered about the powerful German anti-tank weapons waiting in Europe. Some crew members wrote letters home, wondering if they would ever see their families again. But something strange was happening in those Detroit factories. More tanks rolled out each day. Then more. Production lines that had made cars now made tanks around the clock. The numbers grew from dozens to hundreds to thousands. Still, the Allied commanders worried. They had seen German newsreels showing massive Tiger tanks crushing everything in their path. They had heard reports of single German tanks destroying entire Allied tank units. How could these simple American tanks possibly survive? In quiet moments, some American generals smiled at the doubts. They had seen the production reports. They knew something the others did not yet understand. War was not just about building the best tank. War was about building enough tanks. As winter turned to spring in 1943, the first hints of America's true plan began to show. The laughter from Allied headquarters would not last much longer. Spring 1943. The numbers started to tell a different story. While German factories struggled to build 50 Tiger tanks in a month, American plants were finishing 50 Shermans every single day. In Detroit alone, the Chrysler tank arsenal could complete a new Sherman every hour during peak production. The sound of riveting guns and welding torches never stopped. Trains loaded with fresh tanks left the factories in long lines, heading toward the coasts where ships waited to carry them across the Atlantic. British port workers in Liverpool watched in amazement as American ships unloaded tank after tank. They had expected a few dozen, maybe 100 at most. Instead, Thousands of Shermans rolled off the transport ships. The docks filled with olive green tanks parked in perfect rows that stretched as far as anyone could see. Each tank carried enough spare parts and ammunition to keep fighting for months. American supply ships brought not just tanks, but entire mobile repair shops that could fix any Sherman problem in hours instead of weeks. Soviet commanders receiving their first Sherman tanks through the Lend-Lease program discovered something unexpected. The tanks were incredibly reliable. While their own T-34 tanks broke down after a few hundred miles, Shermans kept running. The engines started in brutal Russian winter cold when German tanks froze solid. The tracks stayed on when other tanks threw theirs off on rough ground. Most importantly, when a Sherman broke down, any mechanic with basic tools could fix it using parts that were always available. In North Africa, the first Sherman units faced German panzers in real combat. The thin armor that everyone worried about proved less important than expected. German anti-tank guns could indeed punch through Sherman armor, but they could also destroy the heavier British tanks just as easily. What mattered was that for every German tank on the battlefield, there were 3 or 4 Shermans. When one Sherman was hit, 2 more appeared to take its place. German tank crews who were used to fighting outnumbered suddenly found themselves surrounded. Training camps across Britain filled with American tank crews learning to fight in Shermans. At first, the crews worried about facing the legendary German armor they had heard so much about, but their instructors taught them something new. They would not fight German tanks one against one like medieval knights. They would fight as teams using speed and numbers. 5 Shermans working together could destroy any German tank, no matter how thick its armor. By winter 1943, even the doubters began to see the pattern. German radio broadcasts complained about endless streams of American tanks. German tank commanders reported facing 10 Sherman tanks for every panzer they could bring to battle. The laughter in Allied headquarters grew quieter as a new understanding began to dawn. America had not built the best tank in the war. They had built something far more dangerous. June 6, 1944. Dawn broke gray and cold over the beaches of Normandy as the largest invasion in human history began. In the choppy waters of the English Channel, landing ships carried the first wave of Sherman tanks toward the French coast. The tank crews inside could hear the roar of naval guns pounding German positions and the whistle of shells flying overhead. Many had trained for months, but none had ever seen combat like this. As the landing craft doors dropped open, Shermans rolled onto the sand under heavy German machine gun fire. The thin armor that Allied commanders had worried about for 2 years was about to face its ultimate test. German defenders in concrete bunkers opened fire with everything they had. Anti-tank guns that could destroy any Allied tank began picking their targets. The first Shermans to hit the beach took direct hits and burst into flames. Crews who survived crawled out and ran for cover behind the next tank in line. But something remarkable happened that no one expected. For every Sherman that was destroyed, 2 more appeared behind it. The beaches that German commanders thought could stop a few dozen tanks suddenly swarmed with hundreds. German gunners who had been trained to carefully aim at individual targets found themselves facing waves of tanks moving in all directions. They could not reload fast enough. They could not turn their heavy guns fast enough. They could not target fast enough. By noon, Sherman tanks were rolling inland through French villages that had been under German control for 4 years. French civilians who had hidden in their basements came out to see American tanks filling their streets. Children who had never seen so many tanks in one place climbed on the Shermans and waved at the crews. The tank commanders threw chocolate bars and chewing gum to kids who had not tasted candy in years. German prisoners captured that day stared in shock at the endless columns of American armor rolling past them. In the hedgerow country beyond the beaches, Sherman crews discovered what their simple design really meant. When German anti-tank guns destroyed a Sherman, the crew could often escape because the tank was easy to get out of quickly. More importantly, repair teams could usually fix the tank or strip it for parts within hours. German Tiger tanks that broke down often sat abandoned because they were too heavy to tow and too complex to repair in field conditions. Shermans just kept moving. German tank commander reports from those first weeks told the same story over and over. A single German Tiger might destroy 3 or 4 Shermans in a battle, but 10 more Shermans would appear the next day. The Tiger, meanwhile, would need a week in a repair shop if it survived the fight at all. German officers who had laughed at intelligence reports about American tank production now faced the terrifying reality. America was not just building thousands of tanks. They were building tens of thousands. By July, the breakthrough came. American Sherman units punched through German lines that had held for weeks. The tanks that everyone said were too weak to fight German armor were now chasing German forces across France. Whole German tank units surrendered rather than face another battle against overwhelming numbers of Shermans. Allied commanders who had spent 2 years worrying about Sherman armor thickness now watched their maps as American tank columns raced toward Paris. The moment of complete understanding came during a meeting of Allied generals in August. A British commander looked at the battle reports and said what everyone now realized. The Americans had never tried to build the best tank. They had built the tank that could win the war. While Germany spent years perfecting tanks that only their best mechanics could maintain, America had built tanks that any soldier could operate and any mechanic could fix. The laughter had stopped completely. In its place was something like awe. May 8, 1945. In Berlin, the last German tanks sat silent and broken in the rubble-filled streets. The war in Europe was over. Across the continent, more than 80,000 Sherman tanks had rolled through villages, cities, and battlefields from Normandy to the heart of Germany itself. The tanks that Allied commanders had once called too weak now sat parked in victory formations from France to Austria. Their crews climbed out and looked around at a continent finally free from Nazi control. In the months after victory, military historians began counting the real numbers. Germany had built fewer than 2,000 of their famous Tiger tanks during the entire war. They had produced about 6,000 Panther tanks total. America alone had built over 50,000 Sherman tanks, and they were still rolling off production lines when the war ended. Soviet commanders who had received thousands of Shermans through Lend-Lease wrote reports praising their reliability. British tank crews who had survived battles from North Africa to Germany credited Sherman numbers for their victories. The German tank commanders who survived the war told a different story in their prison camps. They spoke with quiet respect about facing Sherman units. A German Tiger tank commander named Otto Carius wrote in his diary that destroying one Sherman meant nothing because 5 more would appear. He described watching endless columns of American armor moving across the German countryside and knowing that his side could never match such numbers. The thick armor and powerful guns of German tanks had been useless against an enemy that could replace losses faster than Germany could cause them. Back in Detroit, the tank factories that had worked day and night for 3 years finally began to slow down. Workers who had built the Sherman tanks that won the war looked back at what they had accomplished. They had not built the fanciest tanks or the most heavily armored tanks. They had built the tanks that could be produced fast enough and in large enough numbers to overwhelm any enemy. The simple design that everyone had criticized turned out to be the key to victory. Allied military schools began teaching the lessons learned from the Sherman tank story. The French military, rebuilding after years of occupation, studied how American industrial might had succeeded where European military tradition had failed. British tank designers working on post-war projects focused on reliability and mass production rather than individual tank superiority. The Soviet Union, despite having excellent tank designs of their own, continued using Sherman tanks in their army for years after the war ended. Veterans returning home carried with them a new understanding of how wars are really won. Tank crews who had driven Shermans across Europe told their families that victory came not from having the best weapons, but from having enough good weapons to keep fighting no matter what happened. Factory workers who had built the tanks understood that their work on the assembly lines had been just as important as the fighting on the battlefields. The final truth became clear only years later, when military historians could study all the records from both sides. Germany had focused on building perfect tanks that only experts could maintain and only the best factories could produce. America had built good tanks that any mechanic could fix and any factory could make. When German tank production slowed down due to bombing and shortages, American production kept growing. The war had been won not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the factories of Detroit. The Sherman tank story became a lesson that military leaders still study today. Sometimes the weapon that looks weakest on paper becomes the strongest in real war. Sometimes the design that gets laughed at in the beginning becomes the one that wins in the end. The Allies who had once laughed at America's simple Sherman tanks learned the most important truth about modern warfare. In a long war between industrial nations, victory goes not to the country with the best weapons, but to the country that can build the most weapons and keep them fighting.